In the year 1911, after more than 2.5 centuries, the most successful conquest dynasty in Chinese history, and one of the most successful period, came to an end. In that year, a series of largely uncoordinated uprisings across the empire prompted multiple provinces to declare their independence from the Manchu Qing state that had ruled since 1644. What would come to be known as the Xinhai Revolution. The events of 1911 overthrew one of the longest-lasting dynasties in Chinese history, and more than that, brought an end to the imperial system itself, which had existed for 2 millennia. Our question is, why 1911? The uprising, which broke out in the Tri-City complex of Wuhan in 1911, was but one of many uprisings against the Qing state that began to crop up from the 1890s onward. In 1895, for example, Sun Yat-sen, who goes on to become the father of the 1911 revolution, helped coordinate a failed uprising against the Qing based in the city of Guangzhou. After the coup failed, Sun fled for his life, traveling by way of Hong Kong and Japan, ultimately to the city of London. In 1900, Sun tried again, helping to coordinate a rebellion starting in Hong Kong. This too failed. In 1907, another failed uprising broke out in Anhui province in the region of Anqing. One of the revolutionaries was a young woman named Qiu Jin, who was there at the founding of the Tongmenghui, and part of the radical expatriate community in Japan. She was only 31 years old at the time of her execution. So why then, with all of this anti-Qing activity cropping up, why was 1911 the moment? There are a number of factors we need to take into account, some which are more general or contextual, and some that are more immediate. First, by this point in time, the colonial crisis was growing. In the wake of the Sino-Japanese War, colonial incursions by foreign powers grew more acute, more ferocious, and more frequent. Whether in the scramble for concessions from 1898, which was prompted by Germany's seizure of the territory of Shandong province, which basically was an imperialist land grab, or in the violent denouement, the suppression of the Boxer Rebellion, and the military occupations that followed. The closing decade of the 19th century was a time of unprecedented colonial aggression and violence. All of this brings us to the second main factor, which was the steady erosion of support for reform, or the reformist camp, i.e. those who still believed that the Qing dynasty could be saved. Confronted with these growing threats, and also equipped with new and powerful ideas of nationalism, whether civic nationalism or ethnic nationalism, disaffected Chinese reformers and everyday people began to speak out increasingly against the Qing, calling not just for its reform, but for its overthrow. A third factor is the way in which these revolutionaries were calling for the overthrow of the Qing. At this time, ideas of race theory, social Darwinism, the competition of the races was circulating from outside of China and being translated into the Chinese language, and was beginning to imbue Chinese revolutionary thought. It generated, in essence, a kind of racialized anti-Manchu revolutionary theory. This was the idea that civilization was not the key element in this question of the legitimacy of the Qing state to rule. Rather, the key question was whether or not the rulers were the same people, the same ethnicity or the same race as those ruled. And so basically we have the beginnings of something like the notion of China for the Chinese, where for the Chinese literally would mean for the Han Chinese. And this would say that no matter their level of civilization, the Manchus, on account of being originally this foreign conquest army, cannot legitimately rule over a Han Chinese majority population. Now, this brings us to more immediate concerns or immediate factors of the early 20th century and what we might think of as self-inflicted wounds. First of all, the Qing elite and the court began in the opening years of the 20th century to become far more aggressive than ever before with its reformist agenda. The very initiatives that just a few years before the Qing court had cracked down upon when proposed by others, and including by the emperor, the Guangxu emperor himself, now they began to champion. In a certain sense, they saw the crisis, they saw the face of the crisis, and they saw the writing on the wall, and they began to realize that short of extreme reformist measures, that this posed an existential threat to their rule. How far were they willing to go? Well, one example here of just how far the Qing court was willing to go was that in 1905, it abolished the civil service examination. That is to say, it dispensed with the education and recruitment system of the empire that had been in service of various regimes, whether in Beijing or in other Chinese capitals, for over a millennium. And there was a commitment, although a bit amorphous, towards the production of new style schools, new style educational structures. That is a relatively extreme reformist measure that the Qing court was suddenly willing to undertake. What is more, in 1908, plans were announced that a constitution would be promulgated in the year 1916. So something that is operating a little bit in the background was perhaps the idea in the minds of Qing officials that perhaps we could transmute somehow into something like a constitutional monarchy. We would retain authority and power, but we would at least be able to buy off and sort of involve important regional elites by means of forming a constitution. Constitutionalism was one of the major calls for reformers at this time. They were looking towards Meiji Japan, which had promulgated a constitution. They were aware of constitutionalism as it existed in European states, in the United States. And so the Qing finally announced its willingness to produce a constitution that would in theory place checks on its power, but would still enable them to rule. In 1908, this reformist experiment grew even more sort of aggressive when within a day of one another, the Empress Dowager Cixi and the Guangxu Emperor perished. A child emperor assumed the throne, too young to rule, so once again there is a regency, and this regency will set in motion an even more aggressive series of reforms. So aggressive, in fact, that the case can be made, and in fact it has been made, that these reformist measures, perhaps more than anything else, is what spelled the doom for the Qing in 1911, in particular by alienating major power-holding elites at the provincial level. What were these reforms? Well, in 1909, there was something that regional elites had been calling for, which was the formation of provincial assemblies. In essence, as we remember from our discussion of the post-Taiping period, since the Taiping Rebellion, and since in essence, the devolution of power, this power that was granted to regional power holders who basically fought and won the war against the Taipings on behalf of the Manchu Qing, the Qing state had never been able to re-centralize that power to any kind of total extent. Instead, provincial power holders grew more and more outspoken in their desire to have anything ranging from total provincial autonomy and self-rule to, at the very least, a much, much more direct relationship and ability to participate in central government. Well, the formation of these provincial assemblies in 1909 was a step in that direction. But then in 1911, the Manchu Qing made a grave error. Looking out over the infrastructure of the empire, the infrastructure in particular of railways, what they saw and diagnosed pretty accurately was that these railways compromised not only the sovereignty of the empire, but also the economic sovereignty of the empire, because so many of them were either directly built by foreign interests, think of the South Manchurian Railway in the Northeast, but also a number of other projects that were basically funded or owned by foreign powers, if perhaps built by Chinese laborers. They designated this a kind of an existential threat to the empire, and their answer was nationalization. That is the nationalization or the takeover of this infrastructure and ostensibly the recovery of Chinese sovereignty, which in theory this should have been a good thing because all of these various reformists and revolutionaries and so forth, that's one of the things that they were most worried about, was the loss of sovereignty to foreign powers. Well, this was a major mistake for the following reason. Yes, it's true that so much of the railway infrastructure was funded, if not outright owned, by foreign interests, but there were also major regional Chinese power holders who had massive financial stakes in these infrastructures. So for them, the nationalization of this infrastructure was more or less the usurpation of their property by Beijing, and this was a bridge too far. This was something that threatened their economic self-interest. And so, arguably for the first time, we begin to have a confluence of anti-Qing or anti-Beijing sentiment, not only by these rabble-rousers like Sun Yat-sen and Zhou Rong and Qiujin, these kind of low-level revolutionaries who are cropping up and being suppressed, but also major, powerful regional figures. So this was the context in 1911 when a series of two, and in fact more, rebellions began to break out. The first in May was in Sichuan and largely centered around this nationalization of the railways. The second, in October of 1911, broke out in the Tri-City complex of Wuhan, which is actually a kind of a triangle of three separate cities. Now, at the outset, there was nothing necessarily to say that this was the big one. There is nothing to say that this could not have been suppressed as all of the other uprisings and anti-Qing activities had been. And in fact, the Qing court did a remarkably good job of suppressing the initial wave of the uprising in Wuhan. So what was different? Well, what was different was the response of these powerful regional leaders to the unrest that was then erupting in the Tri-City complex of Wuhan. In a nutshell, what followed was a wave of secessions, more or less. On November 5th, Hangzhou, on November 7th, Zhenjiang, followed by Fuzhou, followed by Guangzhou, followed by Chengdu, followed by Nanjing, followed by province-level, basically declarations of independence. Regional power holders in a variety of contexts had had enough. And what this meant, in effect, was that from the Qing's perspective, there was no military solution for this. There was no way that the Manchu Qing could reconquer all of these territories that were announcing their independence from Beijing. It was too great of a wave of secessions. So although the Wuhan itself, what crops up there, was more or less initially taken care of, although it persisted, what made this impossible from Beijing's perspective was this cascade, this domino of other announcements of independence from the court. Now, suddenly, what the Manchu Qing is staring down the barrel of is the question of their own survival. Would they be permitted to continue to reside in the Forbidden City? Would they be subject or immune to violence or incarceration after the revolution, should it succeed? All of these questions about the fate of the imperial family. And so from this point, we begin to see the Manchu Qing trying to figure out not how to militarily suppress this rebellion, but rather how to negotiate the terms of their abdication.